He spoke once, and nothing in me was the same. Not because the sound was loud, not because the air changed, but because something inside me, something old, something hidden, something that had learned to survive, shifted. I felt it first in my ribs, a loosening, a breath that went deeper without asking permission. My hands did not move, yet I knew they could have. My eyes stayed down, yet I knew I had been seen. There was no place I could point to, no hour I could swear by, only the certainty that a line had been crossed, before, after, and the world outside kept walking as if nothing had happened. Footsteps kept their rhythm. Dust still rose, then settled. But inside me, something would not return to the old arrangement. I tried to hold it, to name it without words. A pressure in the throat, a tremor behind the teeth, as if a door had opened somewhere in the dark, and the air that came through was not the air I was used to. I had lived a long time with the kind of silence that does not comfort, the kind that teaches you to disappear so you won't be noticed, so you won't be questioned. And yet when he spoke, I did not break. I almost did. I felt the edge of it, that familiar collapse, that urge to shrink smaller, to let the moment pass over me like weather. But the words did not pass. They stayed. They pressed into me like a seal. Not a bruise, a mark. And I didn't know how to carry that, because I had learned to carry other things. Weight, distance, the steady ache of being near life and never touching it. I had learned to move carefully, to keep my presence thin, to keep my need quiet. But now, something in me refused to lie down. It was not confidence, not bravery. It was a simple, dangerous awareness. I was still here, still breathing, still listening. As if listening itself was an act of defiance. My mind reached for context and found none. No safe explanation. Only the sensation of standing on the edge of something irreversible without knowing what it would cost. I felt exposed, not to people, to truth, to the possibility that what I accepted as final was not final. And that terrified me as much as it comforted me. Because change is merciful, but change is also a door. Once it opens, you cannot pretend you did not see what was on the other side. I kept waiting for the world to notice, for a voice to accuse, for a hand to pull away, but nothing corrected it. The world simply continued, and that made the words heavier. If no one else heard, then why did I? If it was not meant for me, why did it find me with such precision? My body remembered things my mouth had forgotten. The taste of fear, the burn of hope, the way you can be surrounded and still be alone. And in that alone place, his voice reached, to interrupt, to stop something that had been draining me for longer than I could count. I did not understand how a voice could do that, but I felt the interruption, like a thread snapping, like a silence being replaced by a different silence, one that did not accuse, one that waited. I wanted to run, I wanted to hide, because when you have lived unseen, being found is frightening. And still, I stayed. I listened. And then, he said something else. But what he said next, no one was ready to hear. Not the crowd, not his enemies, not even his closest friends. Before anything changed, life was measured in precautions, not by days, not by seasons, but by what could not be done, by what had to be avoided before it could even be desired, before it could even be imagined without consequence. Each morning began with the same calculation, not written, not spoken, but known. A knowledge the body carried without asking permission. A knowledge that arrived before thought had time to wake. Where to step, where not to sit, how far to stand, how close was too close. The questions were constant, They did not wait for context. They did not depend on mood. They arrived fully formed, already answered. The body decided first. It always did. Before thought, before intention, before courage had a chance to form. The body learned early that it could not be trusted to forget. So it remembered for me. Every limit, every consequence, every boundary that had once been crossed and never forgiven. It remembered even when I wished it wouldn't, even when I pretended. This day might be different. There was no ceremony to waking, no eagerness, no sense of arrival into a new day. Morning did not feel like beginning. It felt like continuation. Only the quiet assessment of weight and weakness, of breath held a little too long, of strength rationed carefully, as if it might not return if spent too freely, as if the body were a finite thing that could not be replenished once emptied. I learned to measure effort the way others measure distance, not how far I wished to go, but how far I could afford, how far I could go before needing to stop, before needing to withdraw, before the body demanded payment for the attempt. Some days the body felt distant, like something being carried rather than lived in, a vessel that demanded attention but offered no comfort, something that required management, not trust. Other days it was impossible to forget. Every movement reminded me, every shift of balance, every step taken with caution, as if the ground itself were uncertain, as if the earth beneath me might respond if I misjudged my weight. There were places I no longer entered, not because I was forbidden aloud, not because anyone pointed or spoke, but because silence had already answered for me. The answer had been given long ago, and it did not need repeating. Rooms where people gathered, paths where others lingered, spaces where laughter traveled easily from one body to another without asking permission, without calculation, without fear. I learned which thresholds were safe and which were not, which doors closed gently and which closed with consequence, which spaces tolerated presence and which punished it. I learned to move along the edges, not unseen, but unacknowledged. That was safer. Being noticed invited questions. Questions invited explanations. Explanations invited recoil. So I learned the economy of restraint. Say less, move less, exist carefully. Not because I wanted less life, but because less life meant fewer collisions. I became careful with my presence, careful with my shadow, careful with the sound of my own steps, as if even sound could betray me, as if noise itself might invite attention. I could not survive. Touch disappeared slowly, not all at once, not dramatically. There was no single moment when it vanished, no announcement, no warning. First, it was the absence of accident, no brushing of arms in passing, no shared weight on a bench, no casual exchange of objects hand to hand without pause, without recalculation. Then it became intentional distance, a pause before anyone came near, a hesitation that settled into habit, a space that widened without being named, without being acknowledged as loss. Eventually it was complete. The body learned not to expect it. An expectation, once gone, did not return. I cannot say when the last unguarded touch happened. There was no marker, no farewell, no moment important enough to remember. Only that when it ended, something else ended with it. Something unnamed. Something human. Something that had once felt essential and now felt impossible. Silence grew thicker over time. It followed me, not as soundlessness, but as restraint, as the constant awareness of what must remain unsaid. Words became risky, not because they were forbidden, but because they opened doors. And doors led somewhere. I spoke less, not because words were gone, but because words invite response, and response invites proximity. So I learned the safety of quiet, how to exist without interruption, how to remain present without being involved, how to disappear without leaving. Silence protected me. Silence imprisoned me. There were memories of who I had been. They came unexpectedly, without warning, without mercy, in fragments. A voice once recognized, a laugh once returned, a name spoken without hesitation, without calculation, without fear. These memories did not arrive gently. They arrived with weight, with contrast. I did not chase them. They were too sharp. They cut through the careful distance I had built. They threatened to undo the structure that kept me intact. Remembering made the present heavier. So I learned to hold the past loosely, to let it pass without protest, to let it move through me without demanding a response, without allowing it to reopen doors that could not stay open. Shame was not announced. It did not arrive loudly. It settled. It lived in posture, in lowered eyes, in the way the body folded inward, as if trying to occupy less space than it was given, as if shrinking might make me safer. I learned to anticipate the reaction before it came, the step back, the stiffening, the subtle shift away that said more than words ever could. This anticipation became instinct. It saved time. It spared others discomfort. And it spared me the effort of hope. My identity narrowed, not by choice, by repetition. Over time, everything else fell away. Roles, names, relationships. What remained was condition, limitation. The thing that defined where I could stand and where I could not. How long I could stay. How close I could exist. I did not need to be told who I was. The world reflected it daily. In distance, in hesitation, in avoidance. Life happened near me, not with me. Conversations passed just out of reach. Moments unfolded at a careful distance. Joy traveled quickly from one body to another and slowed when it neared mine. I watched people touch one another without thinking. Lean in, exchange weight, rest briefly, against another body. I noticed these things the way one notices weather from indoors. Present. Unreachable. There were nights when the weight of it pressed harder, when exhaustion was not only physical, when the effort of maintaining distance felt heavier than the distance itself, when even restraint felt like labor. But even then, I did not imagine change. Change requires permission, and I had learned not to ask for what I could not keep. The days blurred together, not because nothing happened, but because everything repeated. Precaution, avoidance, control. The body learned its boundaries well, too well. And yet beneath all of it, something remained awake. Not hope, not yet. Something quieter, something closer to endurance. The ability to remain, to continue breathing, to continue walking, even when walking led nowhere new. Even when movement changed nothing. I did not expect interruption. Life had trained me not to. I expected continuation. More of the same careful steps, more silence, more distance. That expectation felt permanent. If you want to hear more moments like this, the words, the encounters, the silences, subscribe to The Nazarene Speaks. This channel exists to listen and to remember. Where are you listening from? Write your city or country in the comments. His voice reaches farther than we imagine. I did not know yet that this careful life was about to be disturbed. But before disturbance, before interruption, before anything dared to break the pattern, there was only this. A body that learned to endure, a presence that learned to withdraw, a soul that remained awake, quietly, without knowing why. There was a moment when wanting became dangerous, not because the desire was new, but because it refused to stay quiet. Until then, everything had been manageable. Distance could be calculated. Absence could be endured. Life could be reduced. Reduced to margins. Reduced to precautions. Reduced to survival without expectation. I had learned how to live that way. How to make peace with less. How to convince myself that less was enough. But desire does not respect reductions. It does not wait to be invited. It does not ask whether there is space. It arrives already whole, already heavy, already asking something of you. It arrived without permission, without logic, without regard for what had already been lost. I did not choose it. It chose me. A thought formed before I could stop it, before discipline could interrupt it, before habit could press it back into silence. A thought I had not allowed myself to finish in years. What if? The word felt heavy, unstable, like stepping onto ground that might give way. What if meant exposure? What if meant risk? What if meant standing closer to something I had trained myself to avoid with care and precision? I had learned avoidance well. It had kept me intact. I tried to silence the thought immediately, not gently, urgently. I reminded myself of what I was, of where I stood, of how the world had already answered me long before I ever asked. He wouldn't speak to someone like me. The sentence felt rehearsed, safe, familiar. It fit easily in my mouth. It required no courage to say. It had protected me before, from disappointment, from humiliation, from the effort of hoping. I repeated it slowly, as if repetition might seal it shut. He wouldn't speak to someone like me, not someone whose presence required calculation, not someone whose body carried consequences into every space it entered, not someone who had learned to live by subtraction instead of addition. I had become skilled at subtracting myself, and yet the thought remained, persistent, uninvited. It did not argue. It did not explain itself. It simply stayed. I felt the pull before I understood it. Not toward him exactly, not toward a person or a face, but toward the possibility that something else existed beyond endurance. The desire frightened me because it did not ask whether I deserved it. It did not negotiate. It did not wait for permission. It simply existed. I watched others move freely, step forward without hesitation, stand where I could not stand without, calculating the cost. They occupied space as if space welcomed them. I told myself they were different, cleaner, stronger, less complicated. I told myself there were reasons they belonged where I did not. Reasons I did not need explained anymore. I had learned them by watching. Even if he saw me, he would turn away. The words came quickly, as if they had been waiting for the opportunity to rise. They settled into place without resistance. I imagined the moment clearly. The pause, the recognition, the slight tightening of attention, the subtle shift, the turning of his focus elsewhere. Not cruel, not loud, not dramatic, just enough. Enough to remind me that I had misjudged my place and overestimated my belonging. I prepared myself for that imagined outcome, the way one prepares for impact, by bracing. I told myself it would hurt less if I expected it. Expectation had become my armor. Hope was inefficient. Hope wasted energy. Hope asked for more than I could afford to lose. So, I leaned into certainty instead. Certainty said, do not approach, do not reach, do not risk what little stability remains. Certainty had kept me alive, but desire does not listen to certainty. It pressed against the boundaries I had built slowly, carefully, deliberately. It asked questions I had trained myself not to answer. Questions I had buried under routine and restraint and silence. What if being seen did not mean being rejected? What if being noticed did not lead to recoil? The thought felt irresponsible, almost reckless. I pushed it away. I reminded myself of the distance, of the rules that were never spoken, but always enforced. Rules learned not from words, but from reactions. I had learned them too well to pretend they no longer applied. I had learned how quickly attention turns when discomfort enters a space, how quickly kindness recalculates when proximity becomes complicated. I had learned how bodies respond when they sense risk. The smallest hesitation is enough. I told myself this was not about faith. It was about realism. Realism said, you already know the outcome. Realism said, you have survived by not asking for more. The desire did not leave. It shifted. It became quieter, more focused, less diffuse. It stopped asking for permission and started asking for courage. That frightened me more, because courage implies choice, and choice implies responsibility. I had lived a long time without believing my choices mattered. It was easier that way, safer. If nothing depended on me, nothing could be lost because of me. I rehearsed restraint again. I told myself to remain still, to remain where I was, to remain unremarkable. I told myself there was dignity in not disrupting the order of things, in not drawing attention, in not becoming a problem. But beneath the rehearsed restraint, another voice formed. Smaller, less certain, less practiced. What if this is the only moment? The thought landed heavily. I pushed it down immediately. Moments like that did not belong to me. They belonged to people who could afford disappointment, people who could recover quickly, people whose loss did not compound. I could not. Disappointment required recovery, and I had learned not to rely on recovery. I stood suspended between movement and stillness, between desire and discipline, between the life I had mastered and a life I could not imagine sustaining. The conflict did not resolve. It tightened. The body responded before the mind reached a conclusion, a subtle shift forward. Then stillness again, as if testing the ground without committing weight. I became aware of myself in a way that felt dangerous, aware of breath, aware of weight, aware of proximity. Awareness invites action. Action invites consequence. I told myself I could leave. I told myself this was foolish. The thought arrived sharp and convincing. This was foolish, wanting what could not be kept, imagining belonging where none had been offered. Foolishness had consequences. I had lived with consequences long enough to recognize the beginning of one, and yet my feet did not move away. They remained, not advancing, not retreating, waiting. I realized then that the true danger was not rejection. It was the possibility that nothing would stop me, that desire might overcome restraint, that I might step forward despite knowing the cost. The realization unsettled me. I had trusted my fear to keep me in place. Now fear was no longer certain. I asked myself what would happen if I allowed the desire to finish its thought. If I allowed myself to imagine the unimagined. The answer frightened me, because imagining meant vulnerability. Imagining meant hope. And hope meant loss was possible again. I stood there caught in the weight of that decision. And if he speaks? The question did not ask for comfort. It did not ask for explanation. It asked for courage. And I did not yet know whether I had any left. There were rumors, not stories told with confidence, not accounts shaped by certainty. Fragments, pieces of sentences that arrived incomplete, as if they had been spoken quickly and released before they could be examined. They carried no beginning, no end, only impact. I heard them the way one hears sound through walls, muffled, unclear, close enough to disturb, far enough to deny clarity. A voice had been heard nearby, not raised, not forced, simply heard. People did not lean in when they spoke of it. They leaned away, as if naming it too directly might draw attention, as if attention itself carried risk. They spoke in lowered tones, in unfinished thoughts, in glances exchanged and then withdrawn. They did not say much. They did not need to. Something happens when he speaks. That was all. The sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. It lingered after conversation moved on. It followed me when I turned away. No explanation followed. No details stayed intact. No one described what had happened. Only that it had. Only that it changed something. That single sentence passed from mouth to mouth, changing slightly each time, its edges softening, its weight remaining. Something happens when he speaks. I tried not to listen. Listening invites imagining. Imagining invites desire. And desire had already proven how dangerous it could be. But rumors are difficult to avoid. They move ahead of you. They arrive before you are ready. They travel faster than caution. Faster than restraint. They slip into silence. They hide inside pauses. They wait inside what is not said. I felt them before I understood them. Not as information, but as pressure. A subtle tightening. A gathering of attention around a place I could not yet see. A shift in the air. A change in how people stood. In how they oriented their bodies. The body noticed first. It always did. My steps became slower. Not because I decided to slow them. Because something inside me was measuring distance differently. Now. What once felt neutral now felt charged. Each movement felt deliberate. As if the ground required permission. As if forward motion needed justification. I did not hurry. Hurry belongs to certainty. This was not certainty. It was vigilance. I stayed near the edges. Where movement is less noticed. Where presence can be adjusted without explanation. Edges offer protection. They allow observation without commitment. The crowd was close enough to feel, but not close enough to touch. Close enough to hear breath. Close enough to sense warmth. Far enough to remain uncounted. I heard the sound of people moving together. Breath. Fabric. Footsteps brushing against dust. So many bodies. So little space. The density unsettled me. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because I had learned how much space I required to remain safe. I knew how to exist in spaces like this. I had practiced distance even where distance was difficult. I had learned to become smaller without disappearing. I let others pass first. I adjusted my pace to match hesitation. I waited for openings that did not announce themselves. Waiting had become instinct. The rumors grew closer, not louder, closer, as if the air itself were compressing around a point. I could not tell where they ended and where my own thoughts began. The boundary between hearing and imagining blurred. Someone had reached for him. The sentence arrived incomplete, unfinished. Someone had been changed. No description followed. No proof offered. The sentence never finished itself. It didn't need to. I did not imagine myself in that sentence. Not fully. Imagination still felt dangerous. Still felt like a betrayal of the careful life I had built. But my body leaned forward anyway. Just slightly. As if responding to gravity. As if proximity exerted force. Each step felt borrowed. Temporary. As if it might need to be returned. I told myself I was only listening. Only observing. I told myself I was not moving toward anything. That this was curiosity, not intention. But movement is not always intentional. Sometimes it is obedience to something unnamed. Sometimes it is response before permission is granted. The presence became undeniable, not visible, not yet, but sensed. The way one senses heat before flame, The way skin reacts before touch. The way awareness sharpens without explanation. The way one knows when something important is near without being told. The air felt occupied, not crowded, attentive, as if space itself were holding its breath. I adjusted my pace again. Slower, slower still. Not to delay, to endure the waiting. Waiting stretched. Time did not move forward. It hovered, it thickened. Each breath became its own moment, each step its own decision. I could feel myself choosing without naming the choice. I felt close, not close enough to touch, not close enough to be seen, but closer than I had ever allowed myself to be to anything that mattered. Closer than safety usually permits. Almost. The word returned again and again. Almost. Almost hearing. Almost reaching. Almost daring. The word carried tension. It balanced promise and threat. I heard voices rise and fall ahead of me. Questions asked and unanswered. Movement that suggested attention had shifted. Something had interrupted the flow. I stopped. Not abruptly. Instinctively. The rumors tightened. Movement compressed into stillness. Someone had paused. Someone had stopped moving. That was all I knew. No explanation followed. No clarification came. No announcement broke the silence. Just stillness, where movement had been. My heart responded before I allowed it to. Not with hope, with alertness. Alertness is safer. Stopping invites notice. Notice invites exposure. Exposure invites consequence. I remained where I was. Between people. Between moments. Neither inside nor fully outside. I could leave. The thought arrived quietly. Reasonably. It did not accuse. It advised. This was enough. I had come far enough. Farther than planned. Farther than necessary. I could turn now and nothing would be lost. Nothing visible, at least. I had not yet risked anything that could be named. I had not crossed a line that could not be erased. The rumors continued without me. They did not require my presence. They would move on whether I stayed or not. But my feet did not turn. They stayed oriented forward, not advancing, not retreating, waiting. The space between us felt elastic, stretching, contracting. At times it felt as if I were closer. At times as if distance had returned without warning. Almost. I became aware of my breathing, how shallow it had become, how careful. Breath carries presence. Presence attracts attention. I had learned long ago to keep mine contained. I listened again. Not for words, for direction, not instruction, indication. The presence did not hurry me. It did not pull. It waited. That unsettled me. Urgency, I understood. Pressure, I understood. Waiting felt unfamiliar. Waiting felt intentional, as if something was allowing me time I had not asked for. The crowd shifted again. A small opening appeared. Not enough. Then enough. I stepped forward. Just one step. Then stillness again. I could feel the weight of the decision now. Not dramatic, not announced, but real. Every step forward reduced the possibility of returning unnoticed. Every step forward increased the chance of being seen. I was closer now. Close enough to sense that something irreversible was approaching. Not healing. Not yet. Exposure. Almost. I stood there, balanced between retreat and arrival, knowing only this. If I waited much longer, the moment would pass. And if I moved, there would be no guarantee of what followed. The waiting became heavier than the risk. And still, nothing happened. Not yet. There was a moment when retreat felt reasonable. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Simply logical. The kind of logic that does not argue loudly, but settles in like a conclusion already reached. I stood there long enough for reason to catch up. Reason is patient. It does not rush. It waits until the body grows tired of holding tension without relief. It waits until muscles ache from restraint, until breath shortens from indecision. Then it speaks. Quietly. Clearly. This is enough. This is far enough. Nothing has been lost yet. The word yet mattered. It carried relief. It promised preservation. I had not crossed into anything visible. I had not disrupted the order of things. I had not drawn attention to myself in a way that could not be undone. I was still anonymous, still uncounted. That mattered. Anonymity was not emptiness, it was shelter. Invisibility had been my protection for a long time. To remain unseen meant remaining intact, unmeasured, unchallenged, safe. The thought of being. Noticed arrived with weight. Not curiosity. Not wonder. Fear. Dense. Immediate. Not fear of him. That distinction was clear. Fear of everything around him. Crowds are unpredictable. They respond quickly to discomfort. They protect what feels clean by distancing what does not. They do not need instruction. They move together instinctively. I knew this. I had lived inside that knowledge for years. It shaped how I stood, how I waited, how I existed. I imagined the moment with clarity. Not the miracle. Never the miracle. The aftermath. The pause when people realize someone like me is too close. The subtle stiffening of bodies. The tightening of space. The recalculation that happens when boundaries are crossed. The moment when attention shifts from him to the disruption near him. Not loudly, not violently. Social correction rarely is. It happens through glances, through silence, through distance that widens without announcement. It happens by removing belonging without explanation. I had learned how quickly a crowd can turn into a boundary, how warmth cools, how openness retracts. I had learned how easily curiosity becomes caution, and caution becomes rejection. This was not imagination. This was memory. The body remembers these things even when the mind tries not to. I told myself this was not courage, but recklessness. That wanting proximity in a space like this was irresponsible. That restraint was wisdom. Wisdom had kept me alive. It had taught me how to endure without attracting attention, how to survive without asking. I told myself there was dignity in staying where I belonged, at the edges, out of the way, undisturbing, places where presence is tolerated because it does not interfere. I told myself that disruption has consequences, and consequences are not shared equally. Some people can recover from being noticed. Some can explain themselves back into acceptance. Some can absorb discomfort and move on. Some cannot. I had learned which category I was in. The world had made that clear. My body responded before my thoughts finished forming. A tightening in my chest. A subtle pull backward. Not panic. Instinct. The instinct to retreat rose like a reflex, as if my body remembered what my mind was trying to forget. It remembered how quickly safety disappears, how slowly it is rebuilt. I felt suddenly large, too present, too close, as if my outline had become visible. I became aware of my shape in space, of how much room I occupied, of how little margin I had left, of the way others might register me if they turned, if they looked. I could still leave. The thought returned with increasing insistence. I could step back, blend again, disappear into movement. Crowds make this easy. They forgive retreat. They reward it. No one would know. No one would mark the moment. It would pass like so many other moments had passed. Unchosen, unremarked. Another almost folded quietly into memory. The rules would remain intact, and I would remain safe. That safety pressed against me now. not as comfort, as argument. It reminded me how much effort it had taken to build. Years of discipline, years of subtraction, years of learning how not to reach, how not to lean, how not to hope. Leaving would preserve that. Leaving would confirm what I already knew. That proximity is costly. That desire invites loss. That hope is expensive and rarely reimbursed. The thought of staying felt suddenly heavier than the thought of leaving, because staying meant risk without guarantee. Staying meant being seen without control. Staying meant allowing something I had trained myself not to allow. Exposure. I lowered my gaze, not in shame, in calculation. I measured distance again, counted bodies, tracked movement, looked for the safest path backward. The body was ready to obey. It had done this before, many times. All it needed was permission. And then, something interrupted. Not sound, not movement, a stillness, not external, internal. As if the urge to retreat met resistance. Not force, not command. Weight. The weight of not moving. The weight of remaining when leaving would be easier. The weight of delaying a choice that had always been automatic. I realized then that the danger was not the crowd. It was the fact that I was still there. Still facing forward. Still undecided. Indecision is unstable. It stretches moments until they must break. I stood suspended between what I had mastered and what I had never practiced. Between the discipline of restraint and the unfamiliar gravity of desire. I felt the possibility of retreat slipping, not because it was taken away, because I was delaying it. Delay is a form of decision, and decisions accumulate weight. The longer I remained, the harder retreat became. The body knew this. It responded with tension. Breath shortened. Muscles braced. Not for action, for consequence. I was aware now of how much I was risking simply by standing still. Stillness had become dangerous. This was the threshold, not the act, not the crossing, the moment before. The place where leaving still made sense, where staying no longer did. I held there, not praying, not asking, simply enduring the weight of the moment. The fear did not leave, but it no longer ruled, and that frightened me more than fear ever had. I did not know yet whether I would move forward, only that if I waited longer, the choice would be made for me. The crowd shifted again. The space changed, and I remained at the edge of the ew. Edge. Everything stopped. Not gradually, not politely. Stopped. Movement froze where it stood. Breath caught in unfinished rhythms. The crowd remained standing but no longer moving. I felt it before I understood it. A sudden stillness. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of attention. As if something unseen had stepped forward and everything else had stepped back. And then he spoke. Who touched my clothes? The words did not rush. They did not rise. They entered the space and waited there. Who touched my clothes? Each word landed without urgency, without accusation. The question did not search the crowd. It searched the moment. I remember how the sound of it felt. Not loud, not sharp, clear, as if the air itself had been addressed. The space around us tightened. People shifted their weight. Not away, but inward. I felt suddenly exposed without being named. The question lingered. No one answered. No one moved. The silence that followed was heavier than the words themselves. It pressed on the chest, on the eyes, on the ground beneath our feet. I became aware of how many people were breathing at once, how many bodies were close, how many hands were near. yet, the question had singled out one act among many movements. Not the crowd, not the press, not the noise, one touch. I could feel the question echoing, not outward, inward. Who touched? Not who bumped, not who passed by, not who reached accidentally. Touched. The space seemed to contract around that word. Touched. I felt the eyes of others searching, not him searching, others. Looking around, looking at one another, trying to measure proximity, trying to calculate distance, trying to decide who no longer belonged. The silence stretched. Time did not advance. It held. I became aware of myself in a way that felt unbearable. Aware of breath. Aware of weight. Aware of being seen without yet being known. And then he spoke again. Not louder, not differently, but with a finality that did not ask for confirmation. Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace, and be whole of thy plague. The word daughter fell first. It did not rush toward the ending. It claimed its place before anything else could be heard. Daughter. The sound of it changed the space, not dramatically, irreversibly. I felt something loosen inside my chest, not relief, recognition. The word did not explain anything. It restored something. Daughter. It named relationship before condition, belonging before outcome. The rest of the sentence followed without interruption. Thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace and be whole. Each phrase carried its own weight. They did not compete. They did not overlap. They stood. I felt the crowd absorb the words. Some stiffened. Some softened. Some looked away. Some looked down. The sound of breath shifted. The space between bodies changed. Not everyone understood what had happened, but everyone felt that something had ended, and something else had begun. I did not feel healed first. I felt claimed. The words did not erase what had been. They placed it behind me. Go in peace. Peace was not noise. Peace was permission. The permission to stand, to remain, to exist without calculating distance. The permission to be present without apology. Be whole, not repaired, not excused. Whole. I felt the meaning of that word settle slowly, not as sensation, as alignment, as if something that had been divided was no longer pulling in opposite directions. The crowd did not applaud. No one celebrated. There was no sound of amazement, only quiet movement, space reopening, breath returning to normal rhythms, life continuing with a difference that could not be named aloud. I noticed how people stood farther apart now, not out of fear, out of awareness, as if they had learned something about proximity, as if they had learned that not every touch is the same. The words remained. They did not fade. They did not echo loudly. They stayed, inside me, around me, between us. Daughter, faith, peace, whole. I realized then that the question had not been meant to expose. It had been meant to restore, not by explanation, by voice, by presence, by being heard, and by being answered. The world did not return to what it had been, but it did begin moving again. And I stood there, no longer hidden, no longer undefined, knowing that what had just happened could not be undone. Nothing rushed after that. The world did not rearrange itself dramatically. The crowd did not part in reverence. The air did not change color. No sound marked the moment. No boundary was redrawn in the dust. No one announced what had happened. No one named it out loud. Life resumed. People continued moving. Voices returned to their previous rhythms. Feet kept their pace. The ordinary reclaimed its place. But it did not resume the same way. I noticed the absence first. Not something added. Something removed. The constant awareness of threat, the pressure that had lived just beneath my skin, was no longer pressing against my ribs. The vigilance that had governed my breath, that had measured each inhale as if air itself required permission, was quiet, not erased, not forgotten. Quiet. The silence felt different now, not defensive, not braced. It did not crouch inside me. It did not warn me to prepare. It rested. My body responded before I asked it to. Not with urgency, not with relief, with obedience. As if it had been waiting for permission to stand the way it was meant to. It stood differently. Weight settled where it belonged. Balance returned without instruction. Muscles released habits they had carried for years. Habits formed by caution, by memory, by fear, rehearsed so often it had become reflex. They let go without being told they could. I did not check myself for signs. I did not search for confirmation. I did not trace symptoms or wait for doubt to arrive and challenge what I felt. The body knew. It had known before my mind was ready to accept its own agreement. There was no rush of relief. Relief suggests escape. Relief suggests danger narrowly avoided. This was alignment. As if something inside me that had been pulling in opposite directions for years had finally agreed to move together. Forward without resistance. I became aware of space. Not as danger, as possibility. The distance between bodies no longer felt calculated, no longer demanded constant adjustment. I did not count steps. I did not track angles. I did not prepare explanations in advance. People moved around me, not carefully, not cautiously, normally. They brushed past one another. They leaned. They shifted weight. And the world did not fracture because of my presence within it. That alone would have been enough. But there was more. I heard his word again. Not spoken. Remembered. Daughter. The word followed me. Not like a sound. Not like an echo that fades. Like a position. Like a place I was allowed to stand without apology and without qualification. I realized how long it had been since I had been addressed without condition, without warning, without the unspoken clause that usually followed recognition. Just identity. Daughter. The word rearranged me quietly. It changed how I stood, how my spine no longer folded inward as if to reduce my presence, how my eyes lifted without searching for permission, how my shoulders released their practiced curve. No, longer guarding space that no longer needed guarding. I noticed eyes. Some met mine briefly. Some passed over me without pause. But none recoiled. No step back. No stiffening. No sudden recalculation of distance. The absence of reaction was its own revelation. Belonging does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply remains when exclusion does not. I took a step. Then another. Each movement felt ordinary. That was the miracle of it. Ordinary. For years, movement had carried consequence. Each step had required awareness. Each shift had carried risk. Now movement carried continuity. I did not hurry away. I did not linger. I walked. Not toward anything specific. Not away from anyone. Just forward. Forward felt unfamiliar because it was no longer evasive. It did not angle itself to avoid notice. I realized then that peace is not the removal of memory. It is the removal of fear's authority. The past did not vanish. It loosened its grip. It lost its right to dictate my present posture. I passed people without calculating distance, without rehearsing apology, without preparing explanation in case someone asked why I was there. No one stopped me. No one questioned. No one asked me to justify my presence. I felt the difference most in what I did not do. I did not brace. I did not withdraw. I did not measure myself against reactions. The body no longer anticipated correction. It moved with permission. I became aware of how long I had lived as if my existence were provisional, as if any moment might be revoked without notice. That expectation was gone, not replaced by certainty, by peace. Peace did not explain itself. It did not argue. It did not promise. It remained. I understood then that healing is not always loud. Sometimes it is the return of simplicity, the ability to exist without monitoring oneself, without rehearsing removal. I remembered the word again. Whole. Not repaired, not patched. Whole. The word did not erase the years. It gathered them, placed them inside a larger story that no longer ended in limitation. I did not feel triumphant. Triumph implies victory over something external. This was quieter, more intimate. I felt restored to myself and to others. I noticed how my name did not feel heavy anymore, how identity no longer required defense, how I no longer needed to justify my right to remain. I belonged to the moment, to the ground beneath my feet, to the path ahead that did not need to be mapped in advance. The change did not announce itself to everyone, but it remained with me, persistent, irreversible. I knew that tomorrow would not require the same calculations. I knew that silence would no longer function as a barrier. I knew that touch was no longer forbidden by fear. I did not rush to test it. There was no need. Peace does not prove itself. It endures. I carried his words with me, not like a shield, not like a fragile memory I was afraid to lose, like a name. Daughter, faith, peace, whole. They did not fade. As the moment passed, they accompanied me into movement, into presence, into life resumed. Nothing spectacular followed. And that was everything. What word from him still echoes in you? One word is enough. You may not have been the one pushing through a crowd. You may not have felt bodies pressing from every side, or learned how to lower your shoulders to take up less space. You may not have measured distance with your body, or learned to disappear in order to survive. But you know what it is to feel out of place in your own skin. You know the subtle tension that settles before you enter a room, the pause before you speak, the calculation before you move. You know what it is to hesitate before stepping forward. To wonder, even briefly, whether your presence will be tolerated or corrected, whether it will be welcomed or quietly managed. You know the weight of being careful. Some distances are not marked on the ground. They are not written into laws or announced aloud. They live inside the chest, inside the breath. They tighten when you are noticed. They loosen when you are ignored. They teach you where not to stand, where not to linger, where not to reach. They teach you when to speak, and when silence feels safer, when to hope, and when to lower expectation before disappointment has a chance to arrive. You learn these distances slowly, through repetition, through correction, through small moments that train the body before the mind understands. And then one day, you forget they were learned. They feel permanent. They feel like wisdom, like maturity, like realism. You may be listening right now from the edge of a room, not absent, just positioned, from the edge of a season that has lasted longer than you expected. From the edge of yourself, where desire does not fully disappear, but never feels safe enough to step forward. Close enough to hear. Close enough to feel something stir. Not close enough to risk being seen. You may have told yourself that staying where you are is wisdom, that restraint is strength, that not reaching is maturity, that silence is safety. And perhaps it was, for a time. Perhaps it protected you when exposure would have cost too much. Perhaps it kept you intact when life felt unpredictable. But safety is not the same as peace. Safety avoids loss. Peace allows presence. Peace does not require you to disappear. It does not ask you to fold inward or reduce your presence to remain acceptable. It does not demand that you shrink to keep others comfortable. Peace allows you to stand, not aggressively, not loudly, but fully. You may have touched many things without intention. Moments, conversations, opportunities. You may have brushed past them without receiving anything from them. Closeness alone is not the same as encounter. Proximity alone does not heal. Being near is not the same as reaching. What changes a life is not how close you are, but how you reach. With what intention? With what honesty? With what quiet courage? Not the courage that announces itself. The courage that moves even when fear remains. You do not need to shout. You do not need to explain. You do not need to justify why you are there. Faith is not volume. Faith is direction. It is the choice to lean forward instead of retreat. You may be afraid of being noticed, afraid that if you are seen clearly, something will be taken from you. Your dignity, your belonging, your fragile stability. Afraid that exposure will cost more than silence ever did. That fear is not unfamiliar to him. He does not recoil from careful people. He does not turn away from those who learned restraint because life required it. He does not confuse quiet faith with weak faith. He notices intention. He recognizes the reach that carries risk, the movement that is small but costly. And when he speaks, he does not expose you to harm. He restores you to yourself. You may still carry memory. Healing does not erase history. It loosens its authority. It allows the past to remain past instead of ruling the present. It allows you to move forward without asking permission from fear. You may not feel fireworks. You may not feel sudden certainty. You may feel something quieter, alignment. The sense that your breath is no longer being negotiated, that your body no longer anticipates correction, that your presence no longer needs defense. This is how peace often arrives. Not announced, not explained. It does not argue. It does not demand proof. It remains. You may still walk among others without drawing attention, but something will be different. You will no longer be disappearing. You will be present, whole. And if today you are listening with your hand hovering at the edge of a decision, not sure whether to reach, not sure whether to remain, know this: he does not require spectacle to meet you. He does not wait for confidence to be perfect. He honors intention. He recognizes faith that learned to whisper because it lived too long in silence. You are not too late. You are not too much. And you are not disqualified by the care you learned to survive. If you reach, even quietly, he will not turn away. Next, there will be another encounter. And once again, nothing will remain the same. If you want to continue walking through these encounters, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Remain, listen, and walk with us, because the Nazarene speaks.